This is Kamryn and Anna. Our presentation is going to be over Unit 6, which is the Industrialization and Economic Development.
It is where economic geographers analyze the patterns in the economy by studying the economic wealth, poverty, growth, and decline. We'll be going over economic classification, industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, the diffusion of industrialization, Weber's least cost theory, Weber's model, development, more developed versus less developed countries, Human Development Index, informal sector, indicator of development, the development gap, and the industrialization in the U.S.
Our first topic is the economic classifications. Economic classifications is the system of production, consumption, and distribution in the economy. It involves the primary sector, secondary sector, tertiary sector, quaternary sector, and quaternary sector.
The first sector is the primary sector, the part of an economy in which you get raw materials from the earth. Jobs in this sector include farming, fishing, and raw mining.
The second sector is where you process the raw materials that are acquired from the primary sector into finished products of more value. Examples of this is making raw vegetables and fruits into baby food.
The tertiary sector is more focused on selling the finished products from the secondary sector and also involves professional and financial services. Examples are banks, carpet cleaning businesses, and fast food restaurants.
The next sector is the quaternary sector. It involves information creation and transfer. They assemble, distribute, and process information while managing business operations. An example of this is university research.
The quaternary sector is the highest level of decision-making and is a high-level government-targeted research. Examples are legislature or presidential cabinet. It's also important to know that some consider that quaternary and quaternary are subsets of the tertiary sector.
Our next topic is the industrialization. It is the growth of manufacturing activity and economy of a region and usually occurs alongside a decrease in the number of primary economic activities within a country.
The Industrial Revolution occurred between 1780s to 1930s, and the industrial geography of England changed. Created the assembly line, thrived in rich coal deposits in 4 phases: textile phase, metallurgical phase, chemical phase, and electrical phase.
The first phase is the textile phase of 1780s to 1850s. It started the use of steam engines to produce cotton textiles. Britain was the first nation to industrialize and remained the leading industrial nation throughout this phase. Belgium was the second nation to industrialize. There was great demand for U.S. cotton. Slavery strengthened and was the first movement towards the U.S. Civil War.
The next phase is the metallurgical phase, which occurred between 1830s to 1900s. It was the use of machine technology to extract minerals and turn them into usable metal products. Germany industrialized after 1850. By 1890, Germany was the leading industrial nation in Europe. Most significant development was cheap process for making steel. Innovations allowed large-scale production of metal rails for railroad. And steel production allowed steel frame buildings and skyscrapers, which led to greater urbanization. The next phase is the chemical phase. It happened in the 1850s to 1910s. The chemical phase started the use of machine technology to recover minerals from the earth and convert them into usable products. The U.S. became the leading industrial nation in the world in 1890s. Key developments that happened in this phase was the use of chemical fertilizers and vastly improved agricultural productivity. It also caused farm workers to move to cities. Products used were natural gas, petroleum, explosives, oils, asphalt, rayon, aspirin, ammonia, and antiseptics. The next phase is electrical phase, which occurred between 1890 to 1930s. It was the beginning of practical use of electricity to power machinery, electric motor, electric light, and allowed the movement of machine technology into homes after World War I. Diffusion of industrialization happened in 1825.
It was the spread of technology of the industrialization in England and had spread to places in North America and places in Western Europe like Germany, Belgium, and France. In these photos you can see how it traveled. A common industrialization that happened in North America was the Ford productions.
Weber's least cost theory talks about where the factories will be located and how it will affect industrial location. It predicted factory growth in the 20th century. Like von Thunen, who studied the locations of agricultural activities, Alfred Weber studied locations and predicted where the factories would be.
Weber's model is based on the assumptions that the cost of transportation is determined by the weight of the goods being shipped and the distance to the market. Heavier the goods and or farther the distance, the more expensive it is to ship. He assumed the locations are in fixed locations. He also assumed labor only exists in certain places and is not mobile. He assumed a uniform landscape with equal transportation paths throughout the space, like no mountains, lakes, or rivers would be in the way. Where the location of industries are located is by transportation, labor, agglomeration, and deglomeration.
The next topic is about transport, labor, agglomeration, and deglomeration. Transportation and distance are when industries are wanting to locate where transport costs are minimized. That must be considered by two issues: the distance to the market and the weight of goods. Distance is more important on several levels besides shipping. The distances from the factory to its sources energy and raw materials, and factories like to locate close to their sources.
Spatially variable costs are costs that are dependent on the space in which it was located. An example of this is a factory using heavier perishable materials in its production process and might be built as close as possible to the source of the raw materials to minimize the cost of transporting the materials into the factory. Basically, if the factories have heavy materials or raw materials, then they will be closer to the source to save money and vice versa.
The weight losing process is a manufacturing process that makes the final product lighter than the raw materials that went into it to produce it. Examples are paper production factories that are located near forests. The trees are heavier than the paper that is made. Since it is lighter than the paper, it can be shipped longer distances than the tree would be able to. When weight-losing industries are located near the raw sources, it is called material orientation.
Weight gaining process is taking raw materials and making them a heavier final product. Industries will build close to a marketplace instead of the source, since the raw materials are lighter and they can go farther places than the heavier final product. Some industries just maintain the same cost of transportation and production regardless of where they are located. They are called spatially fixed costs.
Buttless industries are industries that produce lightweight products of extremely high value. They aren't bound by locational constraints and can choose whatever location they want. The footless computer chips are often located near university research areas.
Labor is another key factor. In labor considerations, there is the availability of industrial capital, which consists of machinery and the money to purchase the tools and workers for the factory needs. Some industries will move to a place to access lower labor costs, even though the transportation costs might increase as a result. Most factories save money because of cheaper labor, which is called substitution principle.
Agglomeration are the advantages and savings made when industries come together for mutual advantages. Agglomeration has positive effects and lower prices and costs for both industrials and the consumers of their products, called agglomeration economy. There can be negative consequences of agglomeration when other regions suffer a drain of resources and taken, called backwash.
Degglomeration is when the agglomerated regions become too clustered and some industries might decide they need to move for more space. Agglomeration can begin to negatively affect industries in forms of excessive pollution, traffic congestion, lack of resources, and labor.
Development is the process of improving the material condition of people through the growth and diffusion of technology and knowledge. More developed versus less developed. More developed countries are on the wealthier side of the development spectrum, while less developed countries are those on the economically poor side of the spectrum. Both sides of the spectrum face related challenges, with more developed countries facing issues such as maintaining economic growth and less developed countries trying to improve their economic condition. Yet it's difficult to qualify and rank countries according to their level of development. Economic, social, and demographic factors enter into the measurement.
Human Development Index, or HDI, is a measure of development that can be used to compare the various development levels of regions and countries. It's an equation that factors into its measurements in three areas: life expectancy, average educational levels, and standard of living. The economic component of HDI is the country's gross domestic products, or GDP, the value of total outputs of goods and services produced in a country, usually over 1 year. In more developed countries, the GDP per capita, GDP divided by population, is greater than $20,000, and in less developed countries, it is less than $1,000. In the United States, the GDP per capita is $35,000, or $10 to $15 per hour, while in less developed countries, it's 50 cents per hour. GDP data are used in calculating purchasing power parity, or PPP, a measurement tool for calculating the exchange rates required for each currency to buy an equal amount of goods.
For example, although the GDP per capita in sub-Saharan African countries is at or below $750, an evaluation of purchasing power parity for that income shows that the buying power in those countries is closer to $4,000 in the United States. One drawback to using GDP as a factor in evaluating human development is that it's an average that doesn't reflect the inequality that may exist among people in a country. For example, a country may have a high GDP that is concentrated in one small elite class of people, while large numbers may be very poor. Like the United States, the richest 10% of its citizens holds 15 times more money than the poor 10% of Americans, thus illustrating a large gap between the rich and poor. The goal of HDI is to create a number between 0.0 and 1.0 by combining three things. 1. Demographic idea is measured by average life expectancy. Life expectancy is ranged between 20 and 82.3, then qualified to 1.0 scale, and originally ranged of 20 to 85 until 2010.
Economic data is measured by GPI per capita. The GNIPC is ranged from $100 to $107,721. Then it was qualified to a 1.0 scale. GDP was originally used instead of GNIPC until 2010.
3. Social data is measured by combining mean years of schooling for those done and expected years of schooling for those in school. MYS counts twice as much as EYS, and they are qualified to 1.0 scale. Originally, the social was 2/3 literacy rate and 1/3 educational level because literacy is quality of education, not quantity. And literacy removed largely because the statistics were inaccurate.
An informal sector is a sector of business transactions that aren't reported and therefore not included in the country's GDP and official economic projections. For example, when students pay a high school student to babysit their children, that transaction is typically under the table or not reported to the government. Other examples of workers performing informal sector economic activities include street vendors selling goods to pedestrians, undocumented aliens working as domestics, prostitutes, and drug traffickers.
An interesting indicator of development is the Big Mac Index, which compares prices of Big Mac throughout the world. For example, a Big Mac costs roughly $1.78 in Thailand, where the gross national income per person was $8,440 in 2005. In contrast, the cost of Big Mac is $3.22 in the United States, where the average income per person is about $42,000. Thus, while Americans earn nearly 5 times as much as Thais, the US Big Mac costs only 2 times as much as the Thai version, making it a comparative expensive meal in Thailand.
The development gap is the widening difference between development levels in more and less developed countries. Simply put, more developed countries are improving in their development levels faster than less developed countries, and the difference in development levels between the two is widening. In the last decade, the GDP tripled in more developed countries, but only doubled in less developed countries. The rate of natural population increase fell by nearly 85% in more developed countries, but by only 5% in less developed countries.
The United States has moved from a secondary sector country focused on manufacturing to a tertiary sector country focused on services. This has led to deindustrialization, that's a process of social and economic change caused by the removal or reduction of industrial capacity or activity in a country or region, especially heavy industry or manufacturing industry. The American manufacturing belt that extends from the northeastern seaboard to Iowa and forms the St. Lawrence Valley to the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. The Rust Belt is an area straddling the Midwestern and Northeastern United States, plus small parts of the Upper South, in which local economies traditionally specialize in large-scale manufacturing. The Sun Belt is an area of warmer, wealthier states in the South that made up one of the first destinations for factory jobs from the North because of less union activities. And lastly, outsourcing, which is the movement of labor and or entire factories to locations that have cheaper labor and often lax environmental regulations.